Have you ever stood in front of hundreds of people wearing the dress of your dreams only to realize that the person you're about to marry has orchestrated the entire day to break you down? That's exactly what happened to me, and I need to tell you this story because if I had known then what I know now, I would have saved myself years of pain. My name doesn't matter, but my story does. Because somewhere out there, someone might be living through the same nightmare I was, and they need to know that what's happening to them has a name, it has a pattern, and most importantly, it's not their fault. I thought I was marrying my soulmate. I thought the wedding day would be the happiest day of my life. Instead, it became the day I finally saw the truth about the man I had given everything to, and that truth was so devastating, so crushing, that I can still feel the weight of it in my chest when I think back to that moment. But let me start from the very beginning, because understanding how I got there is just as important as understanding how I got out. When I first met Marcus, I felt like the luckiest woman alive. He was charming, attentive, successful, and he had this way of making me feel like I was the only person in the room. We met at a friend's dinner party 3 years before our wedding day, and from the moment our eyes met across that crowded table, I felt this electric connection that I had never experienced before. He pursued me with an intensity that felt romantic at the time, texting me good morning every single day, sending flowers to my office, planning elaborate dates that showed he had really listened to everything I told him about my interests and dreams. My friends thought he was perfect. My family adored him. Even my usually skeptical mother would say things like, "He's a keeper, sweetheart. Don't let this one go." And I had no intention of letting him go, because I genuinely believed I had found the person I was meant to spend the rest of my life with. The first 6 months were like living in a fairy tale. Marcus would show up at my apartment with my favorite coffee. He remembered every little detail I mentioned in passing, and he made me feel cherished in ways I had never felt before. He was successful in his career as a financial consultant, which meant he could afford to take me to nice restaurants and weekend getaways. But more than the material things, he seemed genuinely interested in my life, my work as a graphic designer, my family dynamics, my childhood memories. He would ask question after question, and I would open up to him completely, sharing parts of myself that I had kept hidden from previous partners. I told him about my insecurities, about how I had always struggled with feeling like I wasn't good enough, about my complicated relationship with my father, who had been emotionally distant throughout my childhood. I shared my dreams of one day starting my own design agency, of traveling to Italy, of having a small family in a home filled with love and laughter. And Marcus listened to everything, absorbing every word, every vulnerability, every secret fear and hidden hope that I laid bare before him. What I didn't realize then, what I couldn't possibly have known, was that he was collecting information, cataloging my weaknesses, mapping out the exact places where I was most vulnerable so that he could use them against me later. But in those early months, all I saw was a man who loved me deeply and wanted to know everything about me. Looking back now with the clarity that comes from distance and healing, I can see the subtle shifts that started happening around the 7 or 8 month mark. They were so small at first, so easy to dismiss or rationalize, that I didn't recognize them as warning signs. It started with little comments about my appearance, things that seemed like helpful suggestions at the time but were actually designed to chip away at my confidence. He would say things like, "That dress is nice, but have you thought about trying something more fitted? You have such a beautiful figure, you should show it off more." Or, "I love your hair natural, but maybe you could straighten it for our dinner with my colleagues." First impressions matter in my industry. Each comment felt innocent enough in isolation, framed as caring advice from someone who wanted me to look my best. But collectively, they created this constant background noise of criticism that made me increasingly self-conscious about everything, from my clothes to my hair to my weight, to the way I spoke in social situations. I found myself spending more time getting ready, constantly checking my appearance, second-guessing every outfit choice because I was terrified of disappointing him or embarrassing him in front of his friends and colleagues. Then came the subtle isolation, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. Marcus would make comments about my friends, little observations that seemed objective but were actually designed to drive a wedge between us. He would say things like, "I noticed Sarah drinks a lot when we go out with her. Do you think she might have a problem?" Or, "Your friend Mike seems really negative. I just worry about his influence on you." He never outright told me to stop seeing my friends, which would have been an obvious red flag, but instead he planted these seeds of doubt that made me start pulling away from them on my own. When friends would invite me out, I would find myself declining more often, telling myself I wanted to spend time with Marcus instead, not realizing that I was slowly cutting myself off from the support system I would desperately need later. The engagement happened on our 1-year anniversary. and it was everything I had dreamed of. Or at least that's what I told myself and everyone else. Marcus had planned this elaborate proposal at the beach, where we had our first weekend getaway together, with candles and rose petals and a photographer hidden in the distance to capture every moment. When he got down on one knee and pulled out a stunning diamond ring, I cried tears of joy and said yes without a moment's hesitation. But even in that perfect moment, there was something that didn't sit quite right with me, though I pushed the feeling down deep and refused to examine it. The proposal had been so perfectly orchestrated, so meticulously planned, that it almost felt like a performance rather than an intimate moment between two people in love. And as the photographer emerged from his hiding spot to take pictures of us celebrating, I caught a glimpse of something in Marcus's expression that I had never seen before, a kind of calculated satisfaction, like he had just completed a successful business transaction rather than proposed to the woman he loved. But I dismissed that observation immediately, telling myself I was being ridiculous and ungrateful, that I was overthinking things as I always did, that Marcus had gone to all this trouble to make the moment special, and here I was finding fault in it. Have you ever ignored your intuition because acknowledging it would mean facing something you're not ready to face? That's what I was doing, and it's something I would continue to do for far too long. The engagement period is when things really started to change, though the shift was so gradual that I kept making excuses for his behavior, kept telling myself that wedding planning was stressful for everyone, and that things would go back to normal once we were married. Marcus became increasingly involved in every aspect of the wedding planning, which I initially thought was sweet, because so many women complain about grooms who don't care about the details. But his involvement wasn't about sharing the experience with me or making sure the day reflected both of our personalities and preferences. Instead, it was about control, about making sure that every single element of the wedding met his exacting standards and served his purposes in ways I wouldn't understand until much later. We had our first major fight about the guest list, and it was during this argument that I saw a flash of something truly frightening in him, though again I pushed it down and minimized it in my mind. I had made a preliminary list that included about 200 people, a mix of family, friends from different phases of my life, and colleagues. Marcus looked at the list and immediately started making cuts, crossing off names with a red pen like he was editing a document at work. When I asked what he was doing, he said we needed to be more selective, that weddings were expensive and we couldn't afford to invite everyone. But as he explained his reasoning for each deletion, I realized he was systematically eliminating the people who knew me best, the friends who had been there through my worst moments and would recognize if something was wrong. He wanted to cut my college roommate Jessica, who had seen me through a difficult breakup and knew how I looked when I was genuinely happy versus when I was pretending. He wanted to cut my cousin Danny, who had always been protective of me, and had expressed some subtle concerns about Marcus after meeting him a few times. He wanted to cut my old boss Patricia, who had mentored me and encouraged my independence and career ambitions. When I pushed back, Marcus's entire demeanor changed in an instant. His face hardened. His voice dropped to this cold, measured tone that I had never heard him use before, and he said, "I'm trying to be practical here, but if you want to be selfish and blow our entire budget on people you barely even talk to anymore, then fine. But don't come crying to me when we can't afford the honeymoon you've been dreaming about." The words hit me like a slap, not just because of what he said, but because of the contempt in his voice when he said it, like I was a foolish child who couldn't understand basic financial planning. I tried to explain that these weren't people I barely talked to. They were important relationships that I wanted to maintain and celebrate with, but he cut me off with a dismissive wave of his hand and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there with tears streaming down my face and my carefully prepared guest list covered in angry red slashes. That night, he gave me the silent treatment for hours, refusing to speak to me or even look at me, and I found myself apologizing even though I didn't fully understand what I was apologizing for, just desperately wanting the warmth and affection to return, wanting him to look at me with love again instead of that cold distance that made me feel like I was disappearing. This pattern would repeat itself over and over during the engagement, this cycle of criticism, argument, withdrawal, and my increasingly desperate attempts to win back his approval. He criticized the venue I had fallen in love with, saying it was too rustic and not sophisticated enough for his colleagues. He hated the color scheme I had chosen, calling it juvenile, and suggesting something more neutral and elegant. He had opinions about everything from the font on the invitations to the flavor of the cake to the style of my dress, and every opinion was delivered with this undertone of disappointment, like I was constantly failing to meet his standards. I started second-guessing every decision, running everything by him before committing to anything, molding the wedding into his vision rather than ours because it was easier than enduring his criticism and subsequent withdrawal. My friends started commenting that I seemed stressed and not as excited as I should be, but I deflected their concerns with jokes about bridezilla moments and normal wedding planning stress. Deep down, though, I was exhausted all the time, walking on eggshells, constantly anxious about what might set him off next, and beginning to lose touch with the person I had been before I met him. The comments about my appearance intensified during this time, becoming more frequent and more cutting. Marcus started suggesting that I lose weight before the wedding, framing it as wanting me to feel confident and beautiful in my dress, but the way he said it made it clear that he was ashamed of how I looked. He would make comments about what I ate, raising his eyebrows when I reached for seconds at dinner, or suggesting we skip dessert because we were both trying to be healthy, though he never seemed to apply the same restrictions to himself. He bought me a gym membership and a session with a personal trainer, presenting it as a gift but making it clear that it came with expectations. I started skipping meals, obsessing over every calorie, exercising to the point of exhaustion, all while he watched and commented on my progress or lack thereof. When I lost 15 pounds, he said I looked better, but suggested another 10 would really make a difference. When I lost 20 pounds, he said I was getting there but shouldn't get complacent now. No amount of weight loss was ever enough to earn his unconditional approval, because the criticism wasn't really about my weight at all. It was about keeping me insecure and focused on pleasing him, about maintaining control through a constant state of striving and never quite measuring up. My family noticed the weight loss and asked if I was okay, but I assured them I was just getting in shape for the wedding, that I wanted to look my best in the photos, carefully hiding the fact that I was often lightheaded from hunger, and that my relationship with food had become deeply disordered and anxiety-ridden. The dress shopping experience should have been one of the highlights of the engagement, but Marcus turned it into another opportunity to undermine and control me. He insisted on coming to the appointment, which the bridal consultant seemed surprised by since most grooms preferred to wait and see the dress on the wedding day. But Marcus said he wanted to be involved in all aspects of the planning, that this was our day together, and I felt like I couldn't object without seeming like I didn't want his input or didn't value his opinion. So he sat in the salon while I tried on dress after dress, and he had something critical to say about every single one. The first dress I tried on and absolutely loved, a romantic lace gown with delicate sleeves and a flowing skirt that made me feel like a princess, he dismissed immediately as too traditional and boring. The second dress, a sleek modern design that I thought might appeal to his sophisticated taste, he said made me look washed out and plain. The third, fourth, and fifth dresses all received similar criticism, each rejection delivered with a slight shake of his head and a disappointed sigh that made me feel smaller and smaller with each trip back to the dressing room. The bridal consultant could see what was happening and tried to intervene gently, asking me what I loved about certain dresses and encouraging me to trust my instincts. But by that point, my instincts had been so thoroughly undermined that I honestly didn't know what I wanted anymore. I just knew I wanted Marcus to approve of something, to look at me with pride and excitement instead of that constant expression of vague disappointment. Finally, he pointed to a dress that I hadn't even pulled to try on, a stark white column dress with minimal detail that honestly looked more like something you would wear to a corporate event than a wedding, and said that one would be perfect. I tried it on even though it wasn't at all what I had envisioned, and when I stepped out of the dressing room, Marcus smiled for the first time that day and said I looked elegant and refined. The bridal consultant tried one more time to show me other options, dresses that had more personality and warmth and actually suited my body type and personal style. But I could feel Marcus's mood starting to shift into that cold distance that I had learned to fear, so I said the column dress was the one. As we left the salon with the dress ordered, I felt hollow and defeated rather than excited. But I told myself it didn't matter what dress I wore as long as Marcus was happy, as long as we could get through this day and move forward with our life together. Can you see how much of myself I had already surrendered? How completely I had lost touch with my own preferences and desires in the desperate attempt to keep peace and maintain his approval? The rehearsal dinner happened 2 nights before the wedding, and it was during this event that Marcus publicly humiliated me for the first time in front of our families and closest friends, setting the stage for what would happen at the actual wedding. My parents had generously offered to host the rehearsal dinner at a beautiful restaurant that held special meaning for our family, and I had been looking forward to it as a chance to relax and enjoy the company of the people we loved before the chaos of the wedding day itself. Everything started pleasantly enough, with people arriving and mingling, sharing stories and toasting to our future together. I was wearing a dress I had chosen myself for once, a soft blue number that my mother had helped me pick out and that made me feel pretty and comfortable. But when Marcus saw it, his expression darkened immediately, and he pulled me aside into a quiet corner of the restaurant before the dinner officially began. His voice was low and controlled, but his words cut deep as he asked me why I was wearing that dress when he had specifically suggested the cream-colored one he had bought me for the occasion. I explained that I had forgotten about the cream dress and had already been wearing this one when I remembered, and honestly, I liked this dress better anyway. It felt more like me. His jaw tightened and he said through clenched teeth that I was being disrespectful, that this dinner was important for making a good impression on his extended family who would be there, and that I looked frumpy and unprofessional in what I was wearing. The word frumpy hit me like a physical blow, especially because I had actually felt confident and attractive when I left the house, and now suddenly I felt exposed and ashamed. There was no time to change, and I knew if I started crying, my makeup would be ruined, so I swallowed the hurt and humiliation and walked back into the dining room with a fake smile plastered on my face, trying to hide the fact that I felt completely degraded. Throughout dinner, Marcus made subtle digs at me in front of everyone, comments that seemed like jokes on the surface but carried an edge that made me flinch internally. When I told a story about a funny miscommunication we had early in our relationship, he interrupted to correct me on details that didn't actually matter, making me look like I couldn't keep facts straight. When my maid of honor asked how we were feeling about the wedding, Marcus launched into this speech about how stressful it had been dealing with all the planning chaos, looking pointedly at me as if to suggest that I had been the source of that chaos and stress. When my father made a heartfelt toast about how happy he was to welcome Marcus into the family and how he could see that Marcus truly loved and respected me, Marcus's response was to make a joke about how I had definitely tested his patience during the planning process. But he guessed that's what marriage was all about, learning to deal with each other's quirks and difficulties. Everyone laughed, but I felt the barb behind the humor, felt the way he was positioning himself as the patient, long-suffering partner who was graciously tolerating my shortcomings. My mother squeezed my hand under the table, and I saw concern in her eyes, but I couldn't acknowledge it without breaking down completely. So I just squeezed back and kept smiling. The absolute lowest point of the rehearsal dinner came during dessert, when Marcus decided to share a story that he presented as funny and endearing, but was actually deeply humiliating, and revealed how little respect he had for me. He stood up to make a toast, which I thought was going to be a sweet moment of him expressing his love and excitement about our upcoming marriage. But instead, he launched into this elaborate story about a time early in our relationship, when I had tried to cook him a romantic dinner and had completely botched it, burning the main course and setting off the smoke alarm and generally creating what he described as a disaster zone in my kitchen. The story itself was true. It had been an ambitious menu for my skill level and everything had gone wrong, but at the time, Marcus had been sweet about it, assuring me that the effort mattered more than the outcome and that we could order takeout and laugh about it together. But now, standing in front of 50 of our closest family members and friends, he told the story in a way that made me sound incompetent and foolish, exaggerating the details for comic effect and punctuating the narrative with comments about how he knew then that he would probably be doing most of the cooking in our marriage, assuming he didn't want to survive on burnt offerings and smoke-flavored disasters. People laughed, and I forced myself to laugh along with them, playing the good sport who could take a joke at her own expense. But inside, I was dying. I felt small and stupid and worthless, and I couldn't understand why the man who supposedly loved me would choose to publicly embarrass me like this at an event meant to celebrate our union. When he finished the story and raised his glass to toast to me, calling me his beautiful disaster of a fiancé, I raised my glass in return with shaking hands and whispered a thank you that I didn't mean. Later that night, after we had said goodbye to everyone and were alone in his car driving back to his apartment where I had been staying most nights, I finally worked up the courage to tell him that the story had hurt my feelings, that I didn't understand why he felt the need to embarrass me in front of everyone we loved. His response was immediate and harsh, accusing me of being too sensitive and unable to take a joke, saying that everyone else had found it funny, and I was the only one with a problem, which meant the problem was me and not him. He said I was being dramatic and ruining what should have been a happy evening by taking everything personally and making it about me when he had just been trying to entertain our guests and make the dinner fun. By the time we got back to the apartment, I was apologizing for being overly sensitive and thanking him for being patient with me, once again twisted into a position where I was somehow at fault for my own humiliation. I barely slept that night, my stomach churning with anxiety and dread, and some part of me deep down was screaming that something was very, very wrong, but I couldn't access that voice clearly enough to act on what it was trying to tell me. Have you ever felt like you're drowning but you're surrounded by people on dry land who can't see that you're struggling? That's what those final days before the wedding felt like, and I had no idea that the worst was still to come. The wedding day arrived, and I woke up feeling a strange sense of detachment, like I was watching myself go through the motions from a distance, rather than actually experiencing my own wedding morning. My bridesmaids arrived at the hotel suite where we were getting ready, full of excitement and champagne and the kind of giddy energy that's supposed to accompany this momentous occasion. But I couldn't access any of that joy for myself. I went through the routine of hair and makeup, sitting still while talented professionals transformed me into a bride. But when I looked at myself in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. I had lost so much weight that my face looked gaunt. My collarbones jutted out prominently above the stark neckline of the dress Marcus had chosen, and my eyes had a hollow, haunted quality that no amount of expertly applied makeup could fully disguise. My maid of honor, Jessica, pulled me aside at one point and asked if I was okay. Really okay. Not just wedding day jitters, but genuinely all right in my relationship and in myself. For a brief moment, I considered telling her the truth, admitting that I was terrified and miserable and had been for months, that I felt like I was making a terrible mistake but didn't know how to stop the momentum of this day that so many people were invested in and excited about. But then I heard Marcus's voice in my head, all the things he had said about her over the past year, the suggestions that she was jealous of my happiness or unsupportive of our relationship, and I pushed down the truth that was trying to surface. Instead, I assured her I was fine, just nervous like any bride would be, and I hugged her tightly while silently begging her to somehow read my mind and understand what I couldn't say out loud. The ceremony itself was beautiful from an aesthetic standpoint, everything elegant and perfectly coordinated according to Marcus's vision, held at an upscale venue with stunning floral arrangements and a string quartet playing classical music as guests arrived. I stood in the bridal suite with my father, who looked at me with such pride and happiness that I felt guilty for not feeling the same joy that was radiating from him. He told me I looked more beautiful than he had ever seen me, that he was so happy I'd found someone who treated me well and would take care of me, and I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from crying, because he had no idea how wrong he was about Marcus, and how completely I had hidden the reality of our relationship. When the music changed to signal my entrance, I took my father's arm and walked down that aisle toward a future that I knew deep in my bones was going to destroy me if I went through with it. But I couldn't figure out how to stop walking. Couldn't find the words to halt this ceremony that hundreds of people had gathered to witness. Marcus stood at the altar looking handsome and composed, the picture of a perfect groom, and when I reached him and my father placed my hand in his, I felt Marcus's fingers grip mine just a little too tightly, a subtle reminder of his control even in this supposedly sacred moment. The ceremony proceeded according to plan, with readings and rituals and the exchange of vows that I recited from memory, without fully processing their meaning, my voice steady even as my hands trembled. Then came the moment when the officiant invited Marcus to say his personal vows to me, the words he had written specifically for this occasion. And this is when everything shifted, and I finally saw with crystal clarity what I had been refusing to see for so long. Marcus pulled out a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket, made a show of unfolding it slowly while the guests waited with that expectant hush that falls over a crowd anticipating something meaningful and romantic. He began by saying that marriage was about accepting someone completely, flaws and all, and at first I thought he was heading toward something sweet about unconditional love. But then he continued, and the words that came out of his mouth in front of 300 of our family members, friends, and colleagues were designed specifically to humiliate and diminish me in the most public way possible at the most vulnerable moment of my life. He talked about my insecurities, but not in a compassionate way acknowledging that we all have vulnerabilities. Instead, he listed them like a catalog of defects that he was nobly choosing to overlook. He mentioned my struggles with anxiety, but framed it as me being dramatic and high maintenance rather than someone dealing with a legitimate mental health challenge. He brought up my weight, saying that he was committing to love me even though I might not always look the way he preferred, and I could hear the collective intake of breath from the guests as people registered the inappropriateness of what he was saying. He made reference to the burnt dinner story from the rehearsal dinner, getting another laugh at my expense, but this time in a context that made it even more degrading because we were literally in the middle of making our marriage vows. He talked about my career aspirations as if they were cute hobbies that he was indulging rather than serious professional goals, mentioning that he knew I dreamed of starting my own agency someday, but that he was realistic about the likelihood of that working out given my tendency to get overwhelmed by responsibility. Every single vulnerability I had ever shared with him in confidence, every insecurity and fear and private struggle was now being weaponized against me in front of everyone I knew while I stood there in a wedding dress with nowhere to hide and no way to escape. I could see people in the crowd looking uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, exchanging glances that clearly communicated their shock at what they were hearing. But Marcus continued with complete confidence, seemingly oblivious to or unconcerned about the fact that he was bombing spectacularly in front of our entire social circle. When he finally finished and looked at me expectantly, waiting for my vows in return, I was shaking so hard I could barely breathe, my vision tunneling, my mind screaming at me to run, to get out, to refuse to continue with this ceremony that had just become the site of my complete emotional evisceration. But I didn't run, at least not yet, because the shock and humiliation had frozen me in place, and some deeply ingrained part of me that had been trained over the past year to prioritize Marcus's comfort over my own well-being couldn't process the idea of causing a scene or disrupting the ceremony or disappointing all these people who had traveled to be here. So I pulled out my own vows, the ones I had written weeks ago when I still believed I was marrying someone who loved and respected me, and I recited them with a voice that sounded hollow and far away, talking about partnership and support and building a life together, based on mutual respect and understanding, words that now rang completely false in light of what Marcus had just said, but that I felt compelled to deliver anyway, because what else could I do standing there at that altar with everyone watching? When the officiant pronounced us married and Marcus kissed me, I felt nothing except a desperate urge to disappear, and as we walked back down the aisle together as husband and wife to the applause and cheers of our guests, I knew with absolute certainty that I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. The reception was a blur of fake smiles and forced interactions, with me moving through the crowd like a ghost while people congratulated us and commented on how beautiful everything was, seemingly either unaware of how horrific Marcus's vows had been or unwilling to acknowledge it directly to my face. A few people, including Jessica and my cousin Danny and my mother, pulled me aside at various points to ask if I was okay, or to say tentatively that they thought Marcus's vows had been a bit harsh or unusual. But I deflected their concerns with the same techniques I had perfected over the past year, laughing it off as his awkward attempt at humor or his way of being honest and real rather than delivering the typical saccharine wedding platitudes. I couldn't face the reality of what had just happened because doing so would require admitting to myself and everyone else that I had married someone who fundamentally disrespected me. And I wasn't ready to process that truth yet, wasn't ready to accept the magnitude of my mistake. During the reception, Marcus continued his pattern of subtle public humiliation, making jokes in his speeches about my various shortcomings, correcting me when I told stories to guests, criticizing the way I was dancing or eating or interacting with people, and I absorbed it all with a brittle smile while something inside me slowly crumbled and died. When we finally left the reception and got to the hotel room where we would spend our wedding night before flying out for our honeymoon the next day, I collapsed on the bed still wearing my wedding dress and cried harder than I had ever cried in my life, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere primal and terrified. Marcus's response was not to comfort me or ask what was wrong or show any concern for my emotional state, but rather to get angry that I was being dramatic and ruining our wedding night, accusing me of being selfish and ungrateful after he had given me this beautiful wedding and committed his life to me despite all my flaws and problems. He said I was being manipulative, trying to make him feel guilty when he had done nothing wrong, and that if I couldn't get myself together and be a proper wife on our wedding night, then he would go sleep in a different room and we could deal with my issues after we got back from the honeymoon. I begged him not to leave, apologized for crying, tried to explain that I was just overwhelmed and exhausted from the day. And eventually he stayed, but with an air of martyrdom, like he was doing me this enormous favor by remaining in the room with his hysterical new wife who couldn't appreciate everything he had done for her. We didn't make love that night, we barely spoke, and I lay awake until dawn wondering how I had gotten to this place and whether I would ever find a way out of it. The honeymoon that followed was 2 weeks of carefully curated photos that we posted on social media, showing an idyllic Caribbean vacation full of beaches and romantic dinners and adventure. But the reality behind those images was a continuation of the emotional abuse that had now been definitively established as the foundation of our marriage. Marcus criticized everything from how I looked in a bathing suit to how I interacted with the resort staff to the activities I wanted to do, and I found myself constantly apologizing and trying to please him, and walking on eggshells to avoid setting off his anger or disappointment. There were moments when he would suddenly switch back into the charming, attentive version of himself that I had fallen in love with, and those moments kept me hooked because they made me believe that maybe the wedding had been an aberration. Maybe things could still go back to how they were in the beginning. Maybe I just needed to be better and try harder, and eventually we would find our way to happiness together. But those moments of kindness were always short-lived and seemed to be strategically deployed to keep me confused and off balance, preventing me from getting clear enough about the situation to actually leave. By the time we returned home from the honeymoon, I was exhausted physically and emotionally, my spirit crushed under the weight of constant criticism and control, and I had no idea how I was going to survive being married to this man for the rest of my life. Have you ever felt trapped in a situation that you yourself chose, knowing that everyone around you believes you should be happy, but feeling instead like you're suffocating? That's where I was when we came back from our honeymoon and started our life as a married couple, and the real nightmare was just beginning. The first few months of our marriage were a masterclass in emotional abuse, though I didn't have that language for it yet and couldn't have articulated what was happening to me, even if someone had asked directly. Marcus's control intensified now that we were legally bound to each other, as if the wedding had given him permission to drop even the minimal pretense of respecting my autonomy or considering my feelings. We had moved into his apartment rather than finding a new place together, which meant I was living in his space according to his rules and his preferences, surrounded by his things with no room for my own personality or style to be expressed. He criticized the way I kept the house, complaining that I wasn't domestic enough and comparing me unfavorably to his mother, who apparently kept an immaculate home while also working full-time and raising 3 children without ever complaining or causing her husband stress. He monitored what I ate with increasing scrutiny, commenting on every meal and snack, and I found myself hiding food and eating in secret like a teenager sneaking snacks past strict parents, feeling ashamed and guilty every time I consumed something that he would disapprove of. He controlled our finances completely, insisting that since he made more money than me, it made sense for him to handle all the bills and accounts, which meant I had to ask him for money if I wanted to buy anything beyond basic necessities, and he would interrogate me about every purchase and make me justify why I needed whatever it was I was asking for. He isolated me further from my friends and family, not through explicit commands, but through his reactions whenever I tried to maintain those relationships, sighing heavily when I mentioned making plans with someone or picking a fight right before I was supposed to go out, so that I would either cancel or spend the entire time anxious about what mood he would be in when I got home. Slowly, methodically, he was constructing a cage around me, and I was too depleted and confused to recognize the bars being erected. The worst part was that he was so careful to maintain his public image as a great husband and successful professional, charming and attentive whenever we were around other people, so that if I had tried to tell someone what was happening, they would likely have had trouble believing me, or would have assumed I was exaggerating or being overly sensitive. My work suffered as my mental health deteriorated, with me missing deadlines and struggling to concentrate because so much of my energy was going toward managing Marcus's moods and trying to keep peace at home. My boss noticed the change in my performance and called me in for a meeting where she expressed concern and asked if everything was okay, and I almost told her the truth, almost admitted that I was in a marriage that was destroying me and didn't know how to get out. But at the last moment, I defaulted to excuses about adjusting to married life and promised to do better. I started having panic attacks, waking up in the middle of the night with my heart racing and my chest tight, unable to catch my breath while Marcus slept peacefully beside me, unaware of or unconcerned about my distress. I lost more weight, not intentionally this time, but because I had no appetite, and eating had become associated with anxiety and criticism. I stopped taking care of myself in basic ways, going days without showering or changing clothes when Marcus was traveling for work, too depressed and exhausted to maintain even minimal self-care routines. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw a hollow shell of the person I used to be. All the light and vitality drained out of me, and I couldn't remember what it felt like to be happy or hopeful about the future. The turning point came about 6 months into our marriage, when my mother called me one afternoon and said she needed to talk to me about something important. She had been watching what was happening, she said, and she couldn't stay silent anymore because she loved me too much to watch me disappear into this marriage without saying something. Her voice was gentle but firm as she told me that she was worried about me, that I didn't seem like myself anymore, that she could see I wasn't happy, and she thought Marcus was not treating me with the respect and love I deserved. She asked me directly if he was hurting me, and I immediately said no because he had never hit me or physically harmed me, and I genuinely believed that since there was no physical violence, then what I was experiencing didn't count as abuse, didn't qualify as something serious enough to justify leaving. But my mother persisted, explaining that abuse doesn't have to be physical to be real and damaging, that emotional and psychological abuse can be just as destructive and harmful as physical violence, and that from everything she had observed, Marcus's treatment of me fit the patterns of an emotionally abusive relationship. She had been doing research, she said, after the wedding when his vows had alarmed her so much, and she had learned about things like gaslighting and emotional manipulation and coercive control, and she recognized all of those dynamics in my marriage. At first I got defensive, making excuses for Marcus and insisting that every relationship had difficulties and we were just working through the normal adjustments of marriage. But as she continued to gently but persistently describe what she had observed and compare it to the characteristics of emotional abuse, something inside me cracked open and the truth came flooding out. I told her everything, all the criticism and control and isolation and humiliation, all the ways Marcus had systematically broken down my confidence and autonomy, all the fear and anxiety and despair I had been living with for months. I cried so hard I could barely speak, the words tumbling out in broken fragments as I finally acknowledged what had been done to me and what I had allowed to continue by staying and making excuses and hoping it would get better. My mother listened to all of it without judgment or interruption, and when I finally ran out of words and tears, she said something that changed everything for me. She said that I deserved better than this, that I was worthy of love that built me up instead of tearing me down, and that I had the strength to leave if I chose to, that she and the rest of my family would support me no matter what I decided to do. For the first time in months, I felt a tiny spark of hope, a small voice in my head saying that maybe I didn't have to live like this forever. Maybe there was a way out. After that conversation with my mother, everything shifted because I could no longer unsee what she had helped me recognize, could no longer deny the reality of what my marriage actually was versus what I had been pretending it could become. I started researching emotional abuse online, reading articles and personal accounts and diagnostic criteria, and it was like reading my own life story written by strangers who had somehow witnessed everything I had experienced. I learned about love bombing, the intense charm and attention Marcus had showered on me in the beginning that made me fall so hard and fast that I ignored warning signs and red flags. I learned about gaslighting, the way he would deny my reality or tell me I was being too sensitive or crazy when I reacted to his mistreatment, making me doubt my own perceptions and sanity. I learned about isolation, the systematic way he had separated me from friends and family who might have helped me see clearly or offered support and escape routes. I learned about emotional manipulation, using my vulnerabilities against me, and cycling between cruelty and kindness to keep me confused and dependent on his approval. I learned about coercive control, the way he had taken over every aspect of my life from my appearance to my finances to my daily schedule to my relationships, stripping away my autonomy until I felt like I couldn't make any decisions without his permission or input. Every single pattern described in the resources I was reading matched my experience perfectly, and while it was devastating to acknowledge how completely I had been abused and manipulated, it was also clarifying because it gave me a framework for understanding what had happened and why I had felt so crazy and confused for so long. I wasn't being overly sensitive. I wasn't failing at marriage. I wasn't defective or unlovable. I was being abused by someone who had targeted my vulnerabilities from the very beginning and systematically exploited them to gain control over me. This realization was both liberating and terrifying because once I saw it clearly, I knew I couldn't stay. But the prospect of actually leaving felt overwhelming and impossible. I had no money of my own since Marcus controlled all our finances. I had been so isolated that I wasn't sure which friends would actually show up to help me if I asked. I was terrified of what Marcus might do if I tried to leave, given how much his identity seemed wrapped up in maintaining control over me, and I was deeply ashamed of the fact that I had married him despite warnings from people who loved me, and now had to admit that I had made a terrible mistake. But I also knew that staying meant slowly eroding away until there was nothing left of me, and that somehow I had to find the courage to choose myself over this marriage that was destroying me. I started planning my exit carefully and quietly, knowing that leaving an abusive relationship is often the most dangerous time and that I needed to be strategic about how I did it. I opened a bank account that Marcus didn't know about, slowly transferring small amounts of money from the household account into my secret account, building up enough funds to cover first month's rent and security deposit on my own apartment. I reached out to Jessica and my cousin Danny and several other friends I had been pulling away from, apologizing for disappearing and asking if we could reconnect, gradually rebuilding my support system without Marcus noticing what I was doing. I found a therapist who specialized in domestic abuse and started seeing her weekly, using work meetings as cover for the appointments. And in those sessions, I processed everything that had happened and developed a safety plan for actually leaving. I researched my legal rights and options, learning about divorce procedures and what I would need to do to protect myself legally and financially. I documented Marcus's behavior, keeping a journal of incidents and saving particularly cruel text messages and emails, creating a record of the abuse in case I needed evidence later. All of this planning and preparation took months because I had to be so careful not to trigger any suspicion from Marcus. who would certainly have escalated his control and possibly become dangerous if he realized I was planning to leave. During this time, I had to continue living with him and pretending everything was normal, enduring his criticism and control while secretly working toward my escape, and the cognitive dissonance of that situation was excruciating. But I kept going because I had finally accessed a core truth about myself that Marcus couldn't touch no matter how much he tried to convince me otherwise, which was that I deserved to be treated with respect and kindness, and that I had the right to leave a situation that was harming me even if other people didn't understand or approve. Finally, about 9 months into our marriage and 3 months after I had started planning, I was ready to actually execute my escape. I waited until Marcus left for a week-long business trip, which gave me a window of time to move out without having to confront him directly. I had arranged everything in advance, my new apartment was ready, I had a moving company booked, I had my important documents and personal items identified and packed. I had told my family and friends what day I was leaving so they could be on standby in case I needed support. The day he left for his trip, I went to work as usual, then came home and spent the evening packing up my belongings, sorting through the remnants of my life in his apartment, and taking only what was mine or what I absolutely needed. It was surreal to dismantle my presence from that space, erasing evidence of my existence room by room, and several times I broke down crying as I realized how little of myself I had been allowed to bring into this marriage, how thoroughly I had been erased and molded into what Marcus wanted rather than being accepted for who I was. But I pushed through the grief and fear and finished packing, and the next morning the movers arrived and helped me load everything into the truck. I took one last look around the empty apartment, this place that had been my prison for months, and I felt an overwhelming sense of relief mixed with terror about what would happen when Marcus returned and discovered I was gone. I left my wedding ring on the kitchen counter along with a letter I had written explaining that I was leaving, that I deserved better than how he had treated me, that I would not be coming back, and that he should communicate with me only through my lawyer going forward regarding the divorce proceedings. Then I walked out of that apartment and into my new life, terrified and exhilarated, and determined to reclaim the person I had been before Marcus tried to destroy her. Have you ever taken a leap of faith that felt like stepping off a cliff, not knowing if you would fall or fly, but knowing you couldn't stay where you were any longer? That's what leaving felt like, and it was both the hardest and the best decision I ever made. The aftermath of leaving was complicated and difficult in ways I hadn't fully anticipated, because while I was physically safe in my new apartment and legally protected by the restraining order I eventually had to file, the emotional and psychological effects of the abuse didn't disappear just because I had removed myself from the situation. Marcus reacted exactly as my therapist had warned me he might, with a cycle of attempts to hoover me back through love bombing and promises to change, followed by rage and threats when those tactics didn't work, followed by attempts to make me look like the unstable one to our mutual friends and acquaintances. He sent me dozens of messages alternating between declarations of love and vicious attacks on my character. He showed up at my workplace trying to convince me to talk to him. He contacted my family and friends claiming I was having a mental breakdown and needed his help. He spread rumors about me being unfaithful or mentally ill, or having some kind of crisis that explained my sudden departure. Fortunately, the people who really knew me and loved me saw through his manipulation and supported me through the divorce process. But watching him wage this campaign to control the narrative and maintain his public image as the victimized husband abandoned by his unstable wife was painful and infuriating. The divorce itself took almost a year to finalize, with Marcus fighting me on every single point and trying to use the legal system as another way to maintain control and punish me for leaving. He contested everything from property division to who would pay which debts to whether I deserved any spousal support, dragging out the proceedings and racking up legal fees in what my lawyer said was a classic abuser tactic of continued harassment through the court system. But I had an excellent attorney who understood domestic abuse dynamics, and eventually we got through it, and I was finally, legally, completely free of him. During that year of legal battles and emotional processing, I did the hard work of healing with my therapist, unpacking all the ways the abuse had affected me, and learning to recognize the patterns so I would never fall into that trap again. I learned about trauma bonding and why it had been so hard to leave despite how miserable I was. I learned about the cycle of abuse and why I had kept hoping Marcus would change back into the person he pretended to be at the beginning. I learned about boundaries and red flags and how to trust my intuition instead of dismissing it when it warned me about danger. I grieved the loss of the relationship I thought I was getting into, the future I had envisioned that turned out to be a lie, and the time and energy I had invested in someone who never truly loved or respected me. I worked on rebuilding my sense of self that had been so thoroughly dismantled during my marriage, reconnecting with my interests and preferences and opinions, that I had suppressed in the attempt to please Marcus and avoid his criticism. I focused on repairing relationships with friends and family members that I had neglected or damaged during the marriage, and I was overwhelmed by how many people welcomed me back with open arms and without judgment, just relief that I had gotten out. I threw myself back into my career with renewed energy and focus, and within 6 months of leaving Marcus, I had gotten a promotion at work and was starting to explore the possibility of eventually launching my own design agency like I had always dreamed. Slowly, gradually, day by day and week by week, I started to feel like myself again, or rather like a newer, stronger, wiser version of myself, who had survived something terrible and come out the other side more resilient and more committed to never compromising my well-being for someone else's ego ever again. Now, almost 2 years after I walked out of that apartment and away from Marcus, I want you to understand what I learned through this experience and why I'm sharing my story with you today. First and foremost, abuse is not always physical. And just because someone isn't hitting you doesn't mean you're not being abused. Emotional and psychological abuse can be just as damaging as physical violence, sometimes even more so because it's invisible and people often don't recognize it or take it seriously. If someone in your life constantly criticizes you, controls your decisions, isolates you from support systems, uses your vulnerabilities against you, makes you feel like you're crazy or overly sensitive when you react to their mistreatment, or systematically erodes your confidence and autonomy, that is abuse, and you don't have to tolerate it just because they never laid a hand on you. Second, the early warning signs that I ignored or rationalized away are so important to pay attention to, because abusive relationships rarely start with obvious red flags, but rather with subtle behaviors that escalate over time. The way Marcus collected information about my insecurities in the beginning, the small criticisms disguised as helpful suggestions, the isolation that happened so gradually I didn't notice until I was already cut off from most of my support system, the testing of boundaries to see what I would tolerate, the cycling between intense affection and withdrawal to keep me off balance, all of these were warning signs that I missed because I was caught up in the romance and attention and didn't want to see what they indicated about his character and intentions. If you're in a new relationship and you notice these patterns, please trust your instincts and don't dismiss them just because you want the relationship to work out. Third, leaving an abusive relationship is incredibly difficult and usually takes multiple attempts. So if you tried to leave before and went back, or if you're struggling to leave now, please don't judge yourself harshly. I understand how hard it is because I lived it, and I know that shame and fear and financial dependence and trauma bonding and isolation all conspired to keep you trapped. But I also want you to know that it is possible to leave, that there are resources and support systems available to help you, and that you deserve a life free from abuse regardless of what your abuser has convinced you about your worth or your options. Reach out to a domestic violence hotline, talk to a therapist who specializes in abuse, confide in someone you trust, start documenting the abuse and planning your exit. Do whatever you need to do to stay safe while you work toward getting out. Fourth, healing takes time, and that's okay. I'm 2 years out now, and I still have moments when I struggle with the effects of what Marcus did to me, still have to consciously work on trusting my judgment and setting boundaries, and not falling into old patterns of people-pleasing and self-doubt. Recovery from abuse isn't linear, there are setbacks and hard days, but overall the trajectory has been toward greater strength and clarity and peace. Be patient with yourself if you're in the healing process. Celebrate small victories, and remember that you survived something that tried to destroy you, and that makes you incredibly resilient. Finally, and this is crucial, please understand that what happened to me could happen to anyone. I was educated, financially independent, had loving family and friends, considered myself a strong and capable person, and I still fell into an abusive relationship because abusers are skilled manipulators who know how to target and exploit vulnerabilities. This is not a reflection of weakness or stupidity or poor judgment. This is about encountering someone who deliberately set out to control and harm you. Don't let anyone, including yourself, blame you for what someone else chose to do to you. I'm sharing this story publicly on this channel I live to tell, because I believe that speaking about these experiences openly helps break the silence and shame that keeps so many people trapped in abusive situations. If my story resonates with you, if you see your own relationship in what I've described, please know that you're not alone and there is hope for a better future. I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you or someone you love experienced emotional abuse in a relationship? What helped you recognize it and find the courage to leave? Let's create a community of support and understanding for people who are going through this. And if this video opened your eyes to something you didn't fully understand before, If it helped you see patterns in your own relationship or gave you information that might help someone else, please hit that like button to help this video reach more people who need to hear this message. Make sure you're subscribed to I Live to Tell so you don't miss future stories of survival and resilience, and turn on notifications so you'll know when we post new content. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being part of this community. And remember that you are worthy of love that lifts you up rather than tears you down. You deserve respect, kindness, autonomy, and a partner who celebrates who you are rather than trying to remake you into something else. Don't settle for less than that. And if you're currently in a situation where you're being treated as less than you deserve, please reach out for help. You can do this. You can get out. And there is a beautiful life waiting for you on the other side of that decision. I'm living proof of that, and I'm rooting for every single person watching this who is facing that choice right now. Be safe, be strong, and know that you are not alone.